All right, so I am going to share my screen. So when I'm often drawn to a lecture, usually for some personal reason. And I was getting married in July, and I was writing my intentions, my vows, and I kind of woke up one morning and I heard that I needed to read Self-Will, Pride, and Fear again, because much of my personal challenge in life involves self-will, pride, and fear. And so it was very important for me to sort of begin again to study this lecture and then to want to teach it. So my hope is that, as we go through this lecture, my wish for us is to think about it from the perspective of our own personal life, but also to think about it from the perspective of the world we live in currently. And how does self-will, pride, and fear sort of show up in our world task at the moment? Because I think as we enter into our systems, whether it's a school or a company or a family, understanding how this impacts us collectively is as important as understanding it, how it impacts us individually. So that's my hope, is that we can hold space for both. So any questions before we start? We're good? Okay. Well, let's get moving. All right, so why this lecture? So what I sort of just mentioned is that we're in a particular time of reckoning, maybe individually, but certainly collectively. And how we show up in this time of reckoning, how we show up in this time of evolution or change really will determine the outcome, right? And self-will, pride, and fear are prominent in the energetic field. So Alan was talking about the news, right? Anything that you read politically tends to be somewhat divisive. And in that divisiveness, we stir up fear. We demand things be our way. And we're very unwilling to be humble enough to say, let me listen to the other side, right? So these three aspects of a personality, these three distortions of the personality are very prominent in our culture at the moment. And so there's a real importance at a collective level to be able to address these so that we can impact change. I'm just admitting someone, sorry. So part of the reason why they're so essential in terms of understanding ourselves is because they're all forms of denial. And when I first read that, the first time I read this lecture, I was like, I don't quite understand how fear, pride, and self-will are forms of denial. But the guide is really clear that there are certain spiritual laws. There are certain laws that are that just are. And one of them is that we don't get our way, that life is what it is at times, right? And so to deny that fact, to deny sort of the reality that life has limits, is to be in denial, right? Is to not be in reality. Right? Fear, the basics of fear is that life is not trustworthy, right? That it can't be trusted, it shouldn't be trusted, right? So when we live in fear to some extent, and we'll talk really about the kind of fear we're talking about, because natural instinct fear is actually very healthy. It keeps us from running into traffic, right? We're talking about the fear of the lower self, which says, I cannot trust life, I will not trust life, therefore I must be afraid of all things and I must protect myself. Right? And pride denies the fact that we're fragile. It denies the fact that we are human in some way, right? So anytime that we show up in life in denial, it's going to create a consequence, right? Because we're not in reality, we're not in truth, right? And by definition, if we think of self-will, pride, and fear as defenses, right, as ways to protect ourselves, then we're spending our days channeling our energy towards staving off something that we think is negative, rather than putting our energy towards something that could create connection, create opportunity, create love, right? And so as long as we're in a place of all my energy is going to go towards pushing off the possibility of something bad happening, that doesn't leave a lot of room for dialogue and healing and reconciliation. right? Because most of our energy is like, nope, I'm going to push that off. That's all I'm doing, rather than I'm going to go towards something to create connection. So to confront our challenges personally, interpersonally, and in the collective, we've got to address these aspects of our existence, right? These attributes of our personality, which are, in this case of lecture 30, self-will, pride, and fear. So that's the why. So before we begin, and I think I already talked about this one, is I want us to think about this both from the perspective of our own personal life, right? Our relationships, but also our role as citizens in the world. And in what way self-will, pride, and fear stand in the way of moving us as a culture, as a collective, as a society, as a human race into a more mature, higher developed state. Okay. The second piece, and this comes more from my own sort of bias and belief in training, is that these psychological and spiritual concepts we're talking about also have a biological expression. So what do I mean by that? If we think of self-will, pride, and fear as defenses, meaning we use these things to keep ourselves safe, then our nervous system, right, there is a physiological response also happening in the body, which is our kind of freeze, fight, or flee state. And so it's an interesting conversation to have about, well, I should be more humble, or yes, I should be more flexible, and I shouldn't be so afraid. I mean, if it were that easy, that would be amazing. But these traumas, these defenses that were born out of trauma live in our physical body. And they show up by holding your breath. They show up by tightening the muscles. They show up by physically maybe staying small in order to stay safe, right? So in order to really work through these aspects of ourselves, we also need to bring attention to our physical body and our physiology, because we can't solve this only through the mind. As much as I would like to, we cannot, okay? And the last piece is, and the guide says this often, is we can't do this work from an idealized self. So our idealized self is the part of us that we think is the part of us we think we are. It's our best self, right? I don't have self-will. I don't have pride. Like, I'm humble. Like, that's not me, right? So if that's how we're walking around and that's how we do self-exploration, we're never going to acknowledge that we actually have shadow or shortcomings, first of all. And if we do acknowledge it, the idealized self will almost annihilate us. Like, it will say, how could you be such an awful person that you would do these things, right? And from that place, we can't really evolve. When we say, I'm bad, I'm crap, I'm nothing, there's nowhere to move from there. And in some ways it generates pity, and people say, no, you're not, you're okay. Like, it doesn't force us to take real responsibility. So the invitation always is to do this work from our higher self. And if we can't reach our higher self, then how about a neutral self, like a neutral observer that can just get curious and say, how does this thing show up in my life? I'm curious. So those are our intentions for tonight. Okay. So my supervisor in this work always kind of talks to me about the unfeelable feelings. And I want to introduce them on the outset, because the unfeelable feelings are protected by our defenses. So our defenses in the world, like self-will, pride, and fear, are out there so that we do not have to feel any of these things. Terror, helplessness, powerlessness, grief, hopelessness, humiliation, shame, and there might be others. But these are those feelings that you're like, it would feel so unbearable to feel, or I won't feel it, or I won't even let myself touch it. These are the unfeelable feelings that when we don't feel them, we stay in a defensive posture. If we can work through the defenses and feel the feelings, on the other side of it is just life. It's higher self, right? It's the core of who we are, right? But our worries, our fears of these feelings keep us from who we actually are. And so the unfeelable feelings are going to come up a lot in this presentation, and it's important because these are the feelings, again, that we don't want to feel, and we protect ourselves from having to feel it by taking on defenses like self-will, pride, and fear. And we're going to talk about that. If anyone has questions while I'm presenting, please just kind of raise your hand in the screen. And if I don't see you, if someone could just tell me there's a hand up, but because I can't see all of you while I'm presenting, but I just want to make sure that there's, if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense, or you need something to say something in the moment, please let me know. All right, so let's talk about self-will. And the first thing the guy does in this lecture is differentiates between self-will and free will, right? Free will is our life force, and our consciousness guides where that life force goes. So I get up in the morning, I can make a decision. I can have a donut, or I could have a cup of tea. This morning I got up, I had a donut. I didn't want it necessarily, but I did, and I went and had it, right? That's my free will. I can use it towards making a healthy choice. I can use it making towards not a great healthy choice. That's my decision. Okay, that's free will. And the guide says it's the greatest gift we've been endowed with. It's the thing that we get to use to create whatever it is we want to create in this lifetime and do what we want to do in this lifetime. Self-will is not free will. Self-will comes from an immature place in us that thinks that if it doesn't force its way, it will not get what it needs. It says, I don't trust that if I just let things be, they'll be. It says it has to be a certain way or else, right? It's a forcing current of energy, right? That my will be done. It doesn't accept limits. It doesn't accept reality. It doesn't accept other people's boundaries. It's like, this is what I want. I'm going to get it, and you're going to do it. Right? It's a very different energy than the free will, which might say, hey, I want this. Do you want this too? Let's be in that together. A very different energy, right? So self-will strives to get what it wants, no matter the consequence. Like there isn't necessarily a conscious thought here, but the thought is, you're going to do this. The world's going to work for me a certain way, and I don't really care what the consequence of that is. I want what I want. Right? And it's embedded in the fear that our needs are not going to get met, that the thing we want, we're not going to get. And so we have to force it. It's essential. Now, why? That's a good question, right? And something we'll talk about. But it fears powerlessness and helplessness, right? Because in order for us to accept limits, the healthy ego, the higher self, knows that life has limits. Right? But the little ego, the part of us that's young and immature and sort of not evolved, does not understand limits. It thinks limits is death. So it fights against it. And so we have these two parts of us. And again, not all of this, often this is not conscious, but we have these two parts of us, the higher self, which knows I'm not going to get what I want all the time. And then this other part of us that says, I'm going to get what I want all the time. And it creates tension and anxiety within our system because we're living in two different realities, the one that knows and the one that doesn't know or won't know, right? So self-will, that forcing energy of I have to get my way, never quite feels good because it's a form of denial, but it's also in conflict with a higher knowing in us that says it doesn't work this way. Okay. So these are just some examples of what, if you identify with self-will, that this might be familiar to you, right? So you force your will on others. You insist you get what you want. You insist it has to be a certain way. You might have perfectionistic tendencies, like where the forcing current is almost against yourself. It's not against others, right? It has to be perfect. It must be a certain way. You might have controlling behaviors. It may be very difficult for you to deal with flexibility or an inability to adapt, right? And it's hard to respect other people's boundaries. right? Because if you want what you want and you're in a relationship with someone and they want something else, and you can't tolerate compromise or can't tolerate not getting your way or can't tolerate sort of adapting, you're going to struggle in that relationship. And the guide says, and I think this is true for most of us, self-will is oftentimes obvious, but it's also subtle. So if you're saying to yourself, well, I never say to another person, it has to be my way. Like, I don't say that out loud. I'm not like that. It's a current. You have to really feel into the place of what happens when someone doesn't do something the way I want it. Like, do I punish them in some way? Do I smile and say, okay, yeah, we'll do it your way, but then I go around it and do it another way? Like, the self-will is not such a clear, because when it is, we tend to not get away with it. Right? So if you're feeling like, I don't identify with this, you have to kind of feel into the subtleties of how you are in relationship to the world and what happens when you don't get your way. So what are some of the possible origins of self-will, right? What could have created this monster in us? Certainly an obvious one could be that there was some neglect or abandonment around needs. So there was a way where the child felt, no one's going to take care of me. Like, nobody's going to do it for me. I have to do it. It's all on me. Right. Another might be a power struggle with caregivers. So a power of wills between parent and child. Right. And oftentimes, because a child is a child, the parent will win. And that can be devastating for a child. And so the child says, never again will I be overtaken. Well, my will be overtaken. It will be my way from now on. Right. So that may be another place in which this starts to breed in someone's personality. Chaos or disorder or addiction. A child growing up in that environment will want it to be a certain way to feel safe. So they might develop sort of these perfectionistic tendencies and these strong demands that it be a certain way, not to piss anyone off, but to just create some safety in their life. Right. And the last could be, there's some association the child makes with being special by getting their way. Right. So if I get what I want, I'm loved. If I don't get what I want, I'm not loved. I'm not safe. There's no order. Right. And I identified this and I somehow in my, the way I kind of managed my own childhood was I sort of said that, if there's a God, then I get what I want. Like, somehow my sense of God was me getting what I wanted. And it created a sense of order and safety. And so when I didn't get what I want, I would freak out beyond sort of what was realistic for that thing that I wasn't getting. But what I later understood was the meaning it had to not get what I want. It was that there was no God and there was no order. Like, you can imagine how hard you would fight for something if you felt like not getting it meant chaos. Right. So we have to kind of feel into, if you have this attribute in your personality, what was it like for you growing up around getting your way, about getting what you needed? Was there a power struggle growing up? Was there chaos and disorder? Okay. So I'm going to skip this for now, just because I think we've sort of talked about it, but I don't want to go too much into the lower self, because I think I almost would love to do a second lecture on kind of the lower self aspects of self-will, pride, and fear. But I know there's some folks on the call that haven't read the Pathwork a lot, and lower self is an important concept. And so I'm going to table it for now, and we can certainly come back to it. I think that the thing that feels really important, it's what Alan said earlier, is that our defenses are born out of our higher self. They're not taken from the outside. They're taken from some gift that we have within us. And so if you have self-will as a defense, it means that you have the beautiful qualities of that as well. And some of the beautiful qualities are like perseverance, like you can go fight for what you want. Like you're going to go and you're going to get it. You can endure in a healthy way. You can self-initiate, you can focus, you can manifest, you can lead. And so these are the beautiful qualities of self-will when it's not coming from fear, but it's just the true essence of yourself. So we don't want to throw out self-will. We want to free it from its distortion and fear so that it can be just pure life force that we can then channel towards good, towards creation. Okay. But some of the unfeelable feelings related to self-will, in order to get to the higher self qualities, we have to work through the unfeelable feelings. We have to let ourselves experience the terror, the powerlessness, the helplessness of the moments we didn't get what we needed, of the chaos, of the addiction, of the disorder, right? Of the power struggle. We have to feel those feelings so that we're not so afraid of them anymore, so that we can really step into the beauty of this attribute. Any questions so far before we go on to pride? Okay. Well, so these are just some questions that you can, I'm happy to send you these slides after the presentation so that you have them. Yeah. And these are just some questions to consider as you think about self-will. And if we have time after the presentation, I'd love to just have us do one breakout group where we can talk a little bit about this. But these are some questions to think about as it relates to self-will. And we can, again, I'll send you these slides after the presentation. All right, so let's talk about pride. So pride, which is different from sort of healthy pride. Pride from a defensive standpoint is a certain invulnerability, right? It's an unwillingness to own our fragility, our humanity, right? Our imperfections. It's a lack of humility, right? There's an unwillingness to reveal, right? So you can imagine someone with a lot of pride might have a hard time in relationship, which is about intimacy, right? If intimacy is about revealing oneself and you have a lot of pride and don't reveal yourself, well, the nature of that relationship will be what it is, right? It will be limited to some extent, right? Our pride makes us more important than we actually are, right? And in that self-importance, it can make us competitive. It can make us feel a need to be better than other people, right? And needing to be better than someone else creates separation, right? And so much of our struggle in our world today is about separation and division, right? There's a very strong attachment to the ego, as if it's all we are, right? Which you can imagine then lends to vanity, right? If this is all I am, if Aimee in this body and this mind is all I am, then I'm going to do everything I can to maintain it, right? Because it's all I have, right? So it becomes, again, there's a kind of almost narcissism that comes from it of like, I am all important. And in that, you lose a sense of perspective, you lose a sense of humility, you make yourself more than you are, ironically, because you think so little of yourself underneath it, right? I mean, it's when we're only attached to our ego, it's very limiting, right? There's so much more to us, right? But we get stuck in this place of self, right? And we miss out on the rest of who we are, and that creates issues in connection. And in many ways, the pride is really a fear of humiliation or exposure or inadequacy, right? A fear of loss, of ego loss. Who am I if I'm not this? Okay. So possible origins of pride. And when I say possible origins, a lot of this teaching is the origins of it really come more from the core energetics teachings. And the pathwork doesn't necessarily talk about the origins of these things, but it feels important to think about, like, okay, why am I doing this? Where would this have come from that I choose this as a way to defend myself against pain, right? So this might be a child who has a history of being humiliated, shamed, dominated, accused, seduced or manipulated, betrayed, right? There's a sense of not being seen or accepted for who they are. And so there's sort of an elevation of self, and then there's a shutting down of the vulnerability. So not to get hurt again. Right. And again, pride can be a little deceiving in that we like people who are confident. We like people who can kind of rise above it, right? So there's a way in which our culture really kind of supports pride, right? But the challenge for us is that when it stands in the way of intimacy, when it stands in the way of humility, then it's going to prohibit deepening our relationship to each other. Right. So this is one of my, when I'm confronted about something I've done wrong, even if I know I've done something wrong, I will not show my cards. I will figure out a way to take ownership of it, but not in a way that I will let myself feel the humiliation of making the wrong choice or doing something that's hurtful. Like to me, that's death. And it's like, as much work as I've done on myself, it's like, there's just this place in me that's like, I don't want to feel that pain or that shame of not being perfect, of having a lower self, of being selfish. Like, I pride myself on being a good person and an unselfish person and a caring person. And so when I'm confronted by something I've done that I've actually done, because I'm also selfish and immature and I have a lot of self-will, it's like that unfeelable feeling of terror and shame comes in. And because I don't want to feel that feeling, I double down on the defense. And you can imagine, if you're in a relationship with me, what that does to the other person. They feel unseen. They feel unheard. Right? And it creates distance. So our pride is dangerous. It's dangerous because it doesn't allow us to humble ourselves enough to allow for a space to open where healing can happen. And it's dangerous because of that. Okay. So again, the beautiful aspects, the higher self qualities of pride are, the ability to have perspective, like true stoicism, like a healthy ability to rise above it, right? There's a steadiness, there's leadership, there's integrity, there's strength, right? And so these are this is healthy pride, like a sense of self, rather than the distorted pride, which is a certain like self-importance. A sense of self and self-importance are two different things. So healthy pride is a sense of self with humility, right? And the distortion is sort of pride where it's a self-centered, a self-importance, a sense of superiority, very different energies. Okay. And the unfeelable feelings, again, as I just talked about, is shame, powerlessness, terror, rage, grief, right? Of not being seen, of not having it be okay that you weren't a perfect person. In my case, as an example. So here's some more thoughts for you as you think about pride, right? Where does it show up? What impact does it have? What are the beliefs and images you hold, right? Like, if I admit I'm wrong, then what will happen? If I reveal myself, what will happen? If I accept my goodness and accept my shortcomings, what do I think will happen? Right? And that's where we have to do the exploration so that we get a better understanding of like, what's going on here for me? Why am I engaging in this self-protection that's creating separation? So fear. Let's first, like I said, differentiate between healthy fear. Again, we know not to walk into traffic because there are cars and we don't want to get hit. And so we use our nervous system to gauge when to come into contact and when to pull out, right, to create safety. Very healthy. We don't want to get rid of our fear. We want our instincts to be able to self-preserve, right? But when we live from a place of self-preservation, when there's actually no threat, then we're in what the guide calls kind of our lower self-fear. Right. So I always use the example of a bear when I'm teaching lectures because I'm terrified of bears. If a bear is actually chasing me, I need enough sort of healthy self-preservation to know that I want to get away from that bear because that bear will kill me. Right. There's an actual threat and I need something in my system that's going to, my physiological response, like the hormones getting released so that I can come up with a way to keep myself safe. That's a healthy expression of fear. But if I'm in my house and I'm running from a bear, there is no bear. There's no bear in this house, right? But I'm living as if there is a bear. So I'm vigilant and I'm locking doors and I'm doing things that are not necessary because there's no particular threat, but my nervous system says there is a threat. So I'm living from a distorted place of fear. Right. And beneath that is a certain mistrust. Like it's a mistrust. I'm not safe. I can't trust. I'm not going to be okay. If I reveal myself, I'm not going to be okay. If I don't get my way, I'm not going to be okay. If I don't demand that life be my way, life is never going to be my way. Right. So there's this fear that you're not going to get what you want. You're not going to get what you need and that you're not safe. And this creates, fear. I mean, again, think of any social ill in our culture at the moment. And fear is embedded in it, right? Fear of losing your status, fear of losing power, right? Fear of things changing too fast, fear of not being good enough, fear of not measuring up. Social media engenders fear every day, right? So fear is just, it's metastasized in our culture, right? So we've got to grab onto the fear and say, what is it I'm so afraid of? And am I willing to address it? Am I willing to lean into it so I don't live from that place? And so what the guide says is where there is self-will, there is pride. And where there is pride, there is self-will. And where there is pride and self-will, there is fear. And all of them obstruct our life force. Right. And if we go back to the beginning, if we think of these things as denials of reality, right? If demanding our way, we're not always going to get our way, but if we demand that it is, we are not living in reality. If we deny our vulnerability and our fragility and the truth that our ego is not all of who we are, that will be lost someday, then we are not living in reality. If we live as if life is not trustworthy, that it can't be trusted at all because it doesn't give us what we want, then we live in fear and we don't really get to move our energy towards creation. Again, it gets channeled towards staving off really what the guide calls an inevitable certainty, which is loss, rather than being an acceptance of loss or learning to be in relationship with loss and channeling our energy through free will, through our consciousness towards creation and relationship and connection and love and maturation. And that's the essence of that whole lecture. That's it. It just says, your task in this lifetime is to realize that these things live in you, to find out to what degree they live in you, how they interact, how one is dependent on the other, right? If you don't have fear, there is probably a far more willingness to surrender getting your way. Right? So you can see how it's like, if we don't have one, there's a good chance we may not have the other, right? So how are they dependent on one another? What does it feel like in your body? So when you're engaging in pride, right? If we think about pride, we think of the energy pulling us up, right? We're above it, right? If we think about self-will and we're forcing the energy, you could think of like a tightening, like a contraction and a forcing energy, right? And you think of fear, you might think of sort of staying small, or you might think of height, right? There's some way in where we hold our breath, we have a shallow breath, right? So how do these things show up in your physical body? And what do they protect you from? What unfeelable feeling is this attribute protecting you from? And what would you have to feel in order to give them up? And lastly, what emotional muscle would you have to build instead, right? So you might have to learn to tolerate change. You might have to learn to be humiliated so that you can get to humility. You might have to be willing to be flexible where you've otherwise been inflexible. So there are meta skills, we have to build our ego strength so that we can tolerate the feelings that the self-will, pride, and fear block us from, protect us from. Okay. So that is lecture 30, as I understand it. So I'm going to stop my share here, see if you're all still alive and well. Everyone still seems to be here. Any questions? Yes.
Is it me or was?
Yes, please. I can't see your name. I'm sorry. Hava.
Yeah, and I'm from Israel. Talking to you from Israel.
Oh,
yeah. Okay, so what I wanted to add, and tell me if that's true, is that one essence of the pride is I'm better than you.
yes.
So, and this brings us to be aloof.
Yes. Yes.
And that for itself causes fear.
Yes. Yes. Does that resonate with you? Is that something that you?
No, I do resonate more with fear as fear. Of course, I have the three of them, but I think that fear is more dominant in me.
Yes.
Yeah. And I've been changing, through the years. I can really trace where and when and why it was changed. So
beautiful.
Yeah, this is something. And also, when you were talking, I was just thinking about the three types of the personality, which is very connected to that.
Absolutely. Reason, will, and emotion. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I could see, the connection, of course.
Yes, absolutely.
But this is another part, another lecture. So.
Yes, but it's a great way to get to know I mean, if you run by will, then you're going to identify with self-will and pride even. But, and it's reason, if we think about reason, it's sort of reason rises above the feeling. Right? Reason says, I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to understand it. Right. And there's a level of pride in that we try to move ourselves away from the feeling, from the vulnerability.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's not me.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. Yes, I'm very aware of myself, and my life is really quite good, but there's this constant voice that seems to go on, and it says that I'm not doing enough. I'm not living life enough. I'm not doing enough for the world, and it really, it's not really loud, but I feel it like background noise, and it's diluted to a large degree my enjoyment in life My ability to relax and do things I wish to do at any moment, because it says, well, you're not doing, what you're doing now is not very positive. It's not really helping the world. It's reading a book, and what does that mean? And so on and so forth. I hear it. I listen to it. I believe fighting with it is futile. And so I'm really not sure how to handle it. I do experience the feelings that are generated as a result of it. I try to go to my body, but then I sort of bounce out again. And I don't know whether you might have some insight or comments on that, how to deal with that.
Well, my sense is this word enough, right? The sense is something about challenging this place of I'm not doing enough. There may be a truth, there may be some truth to it, right? So like from our higher self, we can get curious and say like, maybe that's true. Maybe there's a way where I stay small, or maybe there's a way where I don't let myself be fully alive. And what's that about? But the place that says I'm not enough feels more like a distortion, or like an image that there may be an image there about like something got internalized that says a purposeful life looks like this, or you have to be doing this. Like that's how I would look at it. Is one is, where is there truth in that, if there is any? And are you walking around with an image that says you're supposed to be doing something else, something more?
Right.
That would be my first.
That's very interesting. The fact that maybe it's true, and I don't want to accept that.
Yeah.
Because then it means I have to leave my cocoon,
Yeah.
my safe zone.
Yeah. You don't have to, but that free will says here's the energy, go do what you want with it, right? And so you may decide at the end of the day you don't want more, but then make peace with that, right? But it feels important first to say, okay, I'm going to get curious and see if it's true, if there is more here. But I'm also going to try to work through this voice that isn't mine, that's judging me or criticizing me and saying I'm not doing enough, right? Because that's in the way of you actually really figuring out what you want. So that would be my, like, find the truth of it, and then also find the distortion or the defense in it.
And maybe I'm frightened to find the truth, because then I think I have to get out and do something.
Yeah.
But I can come to terms with that and decide I truly don't wish to. But at least I've looked at that side.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, that's very good. Thank
And
you.
that's free will. It's like, I see that I am playing it small, or I see I'm playing it big, and I don't want to do it any differently. Okay. You've made that decision.
Right. Yeah, right. Playing it small. And that seems to be a very common word for me, playing it small. Even though I could attest to the fact that in my life, it doesn't seem that way, but there's a part of me that feels that.
Yeah.
And great. Yeah, good. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah. Anyone else? I find that with this lecture, you'll start to see it in yourself pretty quickly. You know, you'll catch yourself kind of, again, rising above it, or in your competitive place, or in the demand that it be a certain way. And it's an opportunity. It's like, you don't want to make it wrong immediately. You don't want to make it wrong, period, but get curious about it. Like, start to observe it. The way that we affect change in ourselves is we start by simply observing it from an objective place of like, oh, look, I just did that. Interesting. Why did I do that? What was happening where I made that decision? What impact did that decision have? Even if you go do it again the next day, at least you know more than you knew the day before. Alan, were you going to say something?
Yes, I was going to just say that spiritual change happens in a funny way. You know, because we're identified with the ego, we think that the ego makes it happen, but it really doesn't. You know, the ego creates the thoughts, the intention, but somehow it's not nearly the whole picture. Because I think that just being together with you guys, with all of you, with us fellow path workers, an energy is generated that has an effect. And sometimes these concepts take a while to take root. I mean, it's almost as if, you know, that let's say that we're in a toxic environment in some aspects of our daily life, and then we metaphorically come into nature, like a wooded field, or, you know, a forest, and somehow things start being different and growth starts happening. So metaphorically, because we pay attention to these concepts, they start to take root in us and our life starts to change. Yeah, I want to say that.
Yeah.
It's not just figuring it out, you know, it's not just the mind does figure it out, but these things really have to deepen a lot for the change to become manifest.
Yes.
I think in our lives.
It's definitely a, you know, a bottom up, top down approach, right? We need our ability to ask questions and to connect dots, but we also need to recognize that because these are defenses, that they're born out of some kind of trauma. And if trauma sort of lives in the body, right, and our nervous system has adjusted so that we can survive, then we can't just solve it from the mind. We have to sort of work through sort of working through the trauma process within the physical body and the feelings.
Right. And when you talk about that in a sense, self-will, pride, and fear are things that prevent our unfoldment, you know, as who we are meant to be, you know, the unfoldment of our divine selves coming out and becoming stronger. It's like, okay, now we realize what the problem is. The problem is we're being distracted by these things, self-will, pride, and fear. And if we can meditate on the negative and positive aspects of these three things, and we can meditate on how they distract us from our unfoldment, then they distract us less and the unfoldment happens more.
Yes. Yep. So much of the work, this work is about becoming less defended, right? You know, it may be unreasonable to think we can become totally undefended, right? You know, that may not be a safe enough world to be completely undefended, but to be less defended. Because in our defense, we are self-preserving and self-protective. And in that self-preservation and self-protective, like, we don't get to fully be alive, including have relationships, including sort of, you know, again, channel our energy towards creating something amazing for the world. Right. So it's really important that we understand that these aspects of our personality, these attributes, these self-will, pride, and fear are there to keep us safe. We can be grateful that they were there, but we have to recognize that they no longer serve us and they no longer serve the collective, and we are part of that collective. And so, you know, I'll leave you with, you know, in terms of this lecture, of just really encouraging you to get curious about how these things live in you and the impact they're having in the world around you. Right. And to feel into, what is it that I don't want to feel that I'm engaging in these behaviors? And if I'm willing to feel it, if I can work through it and feel it, what might be different in my life? And then you get to decide if you want to be different in your life, right? Going back to Stephen, what you were saying is, like, you might discover that, like, yeah, there's a bigger world for me to be a part of, but I don't want to be in it. Okay, well, then that's the next layer of work. That's another lecture on inertia, right? It's like, okay, but let's work through this layer of defense first. So I encourage you all to read the lecture. I'm happy to send you the slides so that you can have the questions and the, you know, and I think that's all I have to share for tonight, unless there's any comments or any other questions. Esther, it's good to see your face. Hi.
If I can, Tracy, do you have anything to mention? I don't want to call you out or anything, but
Hi, hi. Uh, well, I'm not sure that I do. I've been listening very, very intently. Um, it, I mean, just, I'm in full alignment with everything that's been said. So, don't add anything.
you're breaking up a little bit.
Yeah, I think I heard Tracy say she felt like she was in alignment with what was being said, and yeah. Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah, they're defenses, because I hadn't really thought about them that way before. It was, I've read this lecture many times, obviously it's because when we put up these defenses so that, we don't have to feel the pain of this, that, or whatever, we shut ourselves off. And I hadn't really thought about that until tonight.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it helped me to think about it as a defense because then it begs the question, what are you defending against,
Right.
right? What are you protecting yourself from? And if you didn't
Right.
have to protect yourself from that, what else could you do with your energy? What else could you do with your life force?
Right, exactly.
The guide talks a lot about negative motivation, right? That we're often more times motivated by staving off a negative kind of certainty or what we perceive to be negative. They may are to be motivated to kind of move into something just life affirming, life producing. Right. So rather than, like if we think of a lot of the I've talked about this before, but a lot of the anti-aging, right? It's like to stop something that's happened, like the aging is happening, it's going to happen. And we're spending a lot of energy trying to push off something that is going to happen. Right. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's like, that's where we're sending our energy. And so you can see it in all kind of layers of society, all layers of our lives where we're up to this stuff, right? We're motivated more by fear, motivated to push off something that we perceive to be negative than we are by leaning in and leaning towards something that could be productive and creative. So that's the challenge for us, is to channel that energy away from the fear and towards life, even if we're afraid.
Yeah.
Because we will be, right? And that's okay.